Hello, I'm Dr. Ward Dean, Medical Director for Vitamin Research Products. The first International Anti-Aging Conference, which was sponsored jointly by Vitamin Research and International Anti-Aging Systems, was held on June 17th and 18th, 2000 in Monte Carlo, Monaco. The conference attracted scientists, clinicians, and anti-aging enthusiasts from around the world. These tapes offer an opportunity to listen to the wealth of information that was presented. For those who were unable to attend the conference, it offers a hint of the experience that they missed. Please join me as I listen to one of the speakers at this breakthrough conference. I cordially invite you to join us at the next conference in Monaco next year, which promises to offer a similar roster of international specialists in anti-aging medicine.
Our next speaker has personally experimented with anti-aging medicine for longer than just about anybody I know. He admits to having taken over 1 million supplements. As a biochemist, he is a most sought-after nutritional formulator and consultant. Please welcome James South.
Thank you. My topic today is one that may be somewhat esoteric to some of you. It's nootropic drugs. Nootropic drugs are a fairly unique category of drugs. I'm going to argue today that they are suitable to be taken by, and in fact I personally take them, even by people who don't suffer from any specific neurological or psychological or brain biochemical disease. These are what you might call mind-enhancing, neuroregenerative, neuroprotective, neurofunction enhancement drugs. So they're actually a key anti-aging strategy for the part of the human body that is incredibly prone to aging, which is the human brain. So before I go into nootropic drugs themselves, I need to go into a little background about why the brain, in some ways, is the most prone to aging. The human brain only weighs about 3 pounds, about 2% on the average of the human body weight. It contains, by various estimates, somewhere between 10 billion and 100 billion active neurons, and about 10 times that many oligodendroglial cells that are kind of the chuck wagon cells that surround the neurons and position them in neural space and also feed them the nutrients that they work with. And even though the brain only weighs 2% of the body weight, it consumes approximately 20% of all of the oxygen that we breathe in with every breath. It receives about 20% of the blood supply, and it consumes on the average about 50% of the blood glucose of a person with normal healthy blood glucose levels. One of the things that makes the brain different from most other organs and tissues is, under normal, non-fasting, non-starvation conditions, the brain can only burn glucose as its primary metabolic fuel to generate the ATP bioenergy that it runs on, that it has to consume so much of. I mean, the brain is in many ways like a high-performance racing engine. Its metabolic rate is an average of about 10 times faster than the metabolic rate of other cells of the body. So it consumes furious amounts of glucose every second of your life to produce relatively large amounts of ATP to preserve and run all of its structures and functions. Now, the rest of your cells, with a few minor exceptions, are quite happy to burn fatty acids as an alternative fuel. In fact, the heart muscle prefers to burn fatty acids to generate all the energy that the heart muscle has to use to pump 24 hours a day. But under normal, non-fasting conditions, the brain can only use glucose. And if you think about it right away, this puts the brain at a disadvantage. The brain is up there at the top of the artery tree, top of the gravity well, uphill from the heart, which doesn't work so well in many people the older they get. And the other 98% of the weight of the body cells like having glucose as a fuel as well. So it's like about a 50-to-1 outnumbering of cells clamoring for glucose compared to the brain. And the thing that allows the brain to get its lion's share of the glucose is the very thing that we humans have trouble with, that Ward Dean alluded to earlier. That is, the brain most successfully gets its lion's share of blood glucose to feed itself to make all the ATP it needs if blood insulin levels are low. The brain is one of the few tissues of the body that does not require insulin to extract glucose from the bloodstream. The heart needs insulin. The fat cells need insulin. Your muscles, if they're not exercising, need insulin. Your liver and pancreas and most of your tissues require insulin to extract blood glucose from the bloodstream, but the brain doesn't. If you have, as Ward alluded to, that healthy, low insulin output of a 10-year-old in response to food coming in, then you're not going to overstimulate the rest of the cells of your body to try to suck all the glucose out of the bloodstream. Instead, they're going to take a little bit of glucose, but mainly concentrate on fatty acids for their fuel and leave half of the blood sugar for the brain, which really needs it. But along comes your typical modern Western diet that stimulates massive insulin surges, in part because of insulin resistance, but in part also because many people give themselves a glucose tolerance challenge test many times a day. You know, in a regular medical glucose challenge test, you give somebody normally 100 grams of glucose in solution, flavored like a Coca-Cola, and they drink it on an empty stomach, and you measure the blood glucose and insulin dynamics over the next few hours. Well, you know, many modern people, you know, go to someplace in America, we call them 7-Elevens. They buy what's called a Big Gulp Cola, about a 44-ouncer, you know, in the heat there, especially in the summer, and they're taking in as many grams of glucose from this drink as if they were giving themselves a glucose challenge test in a medical laboratory, and in fact, they're just doing it out there on the pavement in real life. And so they get a big blast of insulin coming out for the next several hours, which then causes all their cells, especially their fat cells, to suck all the glucose out of the blood long before it ever gets up to feed the brain. So that's one reason why our brains have problems in life over a lifetime. We are chronically, episodically starving them in bursts of mini starvation when we have these dietary glucose excesses followed by insulin secretion excesses, which then divert glucose away from the brain into the other peripheral tissues. Another problem the brain suffers from is the fact that along with the heart, cardiac muscle, and the skeletal muscle, these three types of cells do not reproduce normally over a lifetime. By the time you're age 2, you're going to have all the brain cells you're ever going to have, and they're not going to reproduce. They can grow new dendrites and axons, connections to other nerve cells, but the cell body, the 10 billion or 100 billion neuronal cell bodies you've got at age 2, that's got to carry you through a lifetime, minus those that die off along the way, which in some people happens sooner than others. And of course, Alzheimer's dementia is a rather extreme form of a lot of brain cells dying prematurely, because of course classical Alzheimer's tends to occur between the ages of 55 and 60. So brain cells are irreplaceable. You know, you only get so many. When they die, become dysfunctional, you're out of luck. If that happens in the substantia nigra, the dopaminergic tracts in the midbrain, of course you end up with Parkinson's disease once you get down to about only 10 or 20% remaining of your original substantia nigra cells. This is one example of a population of neurons that's really prone by nature in a significant percentage of people to die off prematurely. Men often can start tending towards Parkinson's in their 40s. Women are a little luckier. It doesn't hit them until about a decade or two later, on the average. So brain cells are irreplaceable. And one of the things that will starve them along with inadequate glucose supply is inadequate oxygen. And of course, most of us modern people, we breathe in a shallow way. We're all taught to keep our guts in and our chests out, but that belly breathing, which Dr. Carlson might refer to a little bit, belly breathing is a much more diaphragmatic breathing, takes a lot more oxygen into the bloodstream, keeps the blood more highly oxygenated, and feeds the blood, but that's not how most of us have been grown up trained to breathe. We all tend to under-shallow breathe. We breathe with a chest where you don't get nearly as much oxygenation from the blood. Another problem that makes the brain really have a lot of trouble is that we are all literally fatheads, quite literally. The brain is extremely rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids. In fact, the second most plentiful fatty acid that makes up brain neurons, including the mitochondria and including the outer neuronal membrane, which is where the electrical current passes down, the second most plentiful fatty acid in the brain is a substance called docosahexaenoic acid. You may know it as DHA, one of those fish oil fatty acids. Well, it has 6 double bonds, more than any other fatty acid in the body. And the more double bonds a fatty acid has, the more easily it is rancidified. Now, another thing about that makes the brain unusual is because it has to make so much energy, it's full of mitochondria all throughout the cell, including at the synapse, which is the end of the nerve junction, which hooks onto another cell. And the walls of the mitochondria are themselves in part made of this DHA, extremely easily rancidifiable fatty acid. And that generates a problem. Why? Inevitably, when you burn glucose or fatty acids through what's called the Krebs cycle in the electron transport side chain, which occurs inside the mitochondria, which makes up 95% of our ATP, comes in those two cycles, the Krebs cycles and the electron transport chain. When you burn fuel to make energy, a certain percentage of the electrons that are moved down the electron transport chain inside the mitochondria will leak out of that chain, and they will literally land on the adjacent walls of the mitochondria, which are built out in part out of bricks of DHA. When these electrons hit the DHA, they create free radical forms of fatty acids called lipid peroxides, or acid fat in lay terms. And in turn, you have now damaged the structural wall of mitochondria, and these lipid peroxides themselves can initiate further free radical reactions. So the brain is subject to free radical damage more than probably any tissue or organ in the body, in part because it is so rich in this extremely easily rancidifyable DHA, at the same time that its high metabolic rate will necessarily generate lots of free electrons like sparks coming out of a chimney, flying off and damaging those easily rancidifyable fatty acids that make up the very structural bricks that make up the mitochondria. So brain cells then are prone to free radical damage. This damages their structure, and of course, as the structure goes down, so goes down the function. So we can see the human brain is not in an enviable position. Even if we lived in an ideal world where there was no pesticides, and there was no hydrogenated fatty acids, and there was no junk food, and there was no toxic medical drugs, and there wasn't 1,000 times the lead floating around the atmosphere that there was in 1000 AD because of mining and because of lead in the gas over most of the last century. Even if we lived in a world where people ate properly and didn't have insulin resistance and so on, the bottom line is it's estimated that as much as 5% of the oxygen that we breathe in will end up becoming a substance called superoxide radical, one of the basic forms of free radical in the brain, which in turn ends up becoming hydrogen peroxide, another free radical-like substance, when it's detoxified by SOD. And hydrogen peroxide can itself then react to what's called the Haber-Weiss reaction and create the most damaging free radical of all, called the hydroxyl radical, which, by the way, is what kills you if you get an overdose of radiation, like X-ray or radiation. So even in an ideal perfect world, a perfect diet and perfect climate and no pollutants and everything else, the law of entropy reigns supreme for all things, including the brain. The free radicals that are inevitably, I emphasize that, inevitably generated through normal, healthy brain metabolism will gradually, over a lifetime, self-destruct the brain at some rate or other. And of course, our job is to slow that rate down so that even if we're 90 years old, we can still think and reason and remember with the best of them. Another problem that the brain has was discovered by Roger Sperry back in the 1960s. He discovered that if he surgically split the corpus callosum, which is the membrane that connects the two hemispheres of the brain in the center, he ended up, by sophisticated experiments, discovering that two separate personalities, one for each hemisphere, formed in the brain. He even had dramatic examples where some guy would be talking to his wife that was a surgical split brain patient, and the dominant hemisphere personality would get mad at the wife and would start to strike her. And of course, one hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. And the other hemisphere personality would try to defend the wife, and the other hand would reach out and grab the hand that was trying to strike her and stop it. And the tug of war would go on. Is he going to slap the wife, or is the other personality going to hold it back? Well, obviously, very few of us are surgical split brain patients, but neurological studies show that most ordinary human beings are one hemisphere dominant. For most of us, we're left hemisphere dominant, which controls the right side of the body. This hemisphere's methods of information processing are normally analytical, logical, sequential, looking at micro details and parts as opposed to the whole. Women with their famous women's intuition will often be more right hemisphere dominant. The processing method of this hemisphere is more intuitive, it's more holistic, it looks at the whole more than the parts, it's simultaneous rather than sequential. But most people, when you hook up EEG machines and present them with problems or questions or things to solve, that one hemisphere will tend to be dominant. Most of us rely on one half of our cortex. So in a very real sense, the corpus callosum in the middle of the brain, although it serves to unite the two hemispheres, it in effect becomes like a Berlin Wall de facto separating them. And one of the things that I'll talk about shortly about nootropic drugs is, in both human and animal studies, they have been shown to superconnect the hemispheres. That's the phrase of one of the authors, Stuart J. Diamond, who discovered this phenomenon and verified it in humans through what's called dichotic listening tests. So another problem most of us humans suffer from is our corpus callosum, instead of being our integrator, two halves of our cortex, becomes the separator and reduces us to half of our brain potential. So there's a lot of reasons why the brain needs help in all of us, whether you suffer from a formal brain neuropathology or not. Nootropic drugs were discovered in the mid-1960s at the UCB laboratories in Belgium by Dr. C.E. Georgia. He came up with them as a separate category of drug. They were not like the regular psychotropic drugs such as tranquilizers or stimulants such as amphetamines or neuroleptics such as haloperidol and so on. They have four categories to the definition. They enhance learning acquisition as well as resistance of learned behaviors to agents that impair them. They facilitate the cerebral interhemispheric flow of information that I was just talking about. They protect the brain from various physical, chemical, and pharmacologic injuries. And they lack the usual negative pharmacologic side effects of psychotropic drugs. One of the things that right from the start, the UCB researchers had published, probably 100 papers by the early 1970s on paracetam, the original nootropic drug, was that by all the standard toxicologic and medical and endocrinological and EEG tests of the day, they were considered to be, for all practical purposes, side effect free. Virtually zero side effects, and especially zero significant or toxic or health or life-threatening side effects free, even with high dosage use and even with prolonged use for years. So right away this makes them a unique category of drugs. I mean, let's face it, most drugs you don't want to take for a lifetime. Nootropic drugs are an exception, and one of the reasons why they're an exception is they are amazingly non-toxic. Many of the papers on nootropic drugs continually specifically refer to them as being virtually inert from a side effect standpoint. And in fact, many of the papers on nootropic drugs, the placebo will often generate more side effects than does the nootropic drug in the particular experiment with animals and humans. So that's a key part of their definition. They're basically side effect free. When there are side effects, they almost always fall into a handful of common ones, which is overstimulation, insomnia because of that overstimulation, irritability and agitation, because too much nootropic drugs can be like too much coffee. It wires you a little bit, but that's just because the nerve cells kind of go into almost a hyperfunctional state, but it doesn't induce any toxicity, any structural damage, any long-term negative adverse consequences. There's been about 1,000 papers on nootropic drugs by the early 1990s, about 700 of them on the original nootropic, paracetam. By the 1970s, they had created 3 variants that are commercially available on paracetam: oxiracetam, which is almost identical to paracetam. It's basically paracetam with a hydroxyl group on it, and aniracetam and pramiracetam. You can see here the structural similarities between them. One interesting fact about the original nootropic drugs, for whom this very category was defined to fit them and their actions, is they're very similar to pyroglutamic acid. Pyroglutamic acid is actually an amino acid. It's normally found in micro amounts in the human brain, and it's found in quite a few common animal and vegetable foods. So the original 2 nootropic drugs, paracetam and oxiracetam, which are most close in structure to it, are in a very real sense then analogs of a natural dietary and brain constituent amino acid, which may be one of the reasons why they turn out to be so safe. The properties of the nootropic drugs that have been discovered is an amazing long list. They tend to promote improved blood flow to the brain. Obviously, the older we get, the more brain blood vessels are prone to arteriosclerosis. Most people think of arteriosclerosis in terms of the heart. The truth is, on the average, the brain is just as prone to arteriosclerosis, ever worsening with advancing age, as is the heart. This in turn impairs blood flow to the brain. But again, remember, the brain needs 50% of the blood glucose, 20% of the oxygen you breathe, which is carried in the red blood cells. The brain can only function with glucose as its fuel, and it can only store maybe a minute's worth of glucose. It depends on a minute by minute or second by second blood delivery of fuel and oxygen to be able to live. And as you all know, if you interrupt blood flow to the brain for more than a few moments, you become unconscious, and within a few more moments, the brain begins to die. So anything that enhances in a safe, non-toxic manner blood flow to the brain is devoutly to be desired. Studies with paracetam have shown that it increases the deformability of red blood cells. Don't forget the red blood cells are larger in diameter than is the microcapillaries. They must fold like a paper plate folded into a tube to make it through those capillaries to deliver oxygen to the brain cells. So the more deformable they are, literally, the more easily they can be folded, the more bendable they are, the more effectively they'll carry oxygen to the brain. Now, red blood cells, as they age, get brittle and non-deformable or less deformable. Also, the breakdown product of alcohol ingestion, which is acetaldehyde, tends to brutalize red blood cells. So lots of things, basically, many toxins will impair red blood cell deformability, and thus, ironically, even if you have adequate hemoglobin and hematocrit, you're going to have less effective delivery of blood oxygen to the brain. Paracetam also tends to inhibit the adherence of red blood cells to the endothelium, as well as sickle cells to the endothelium. So enhancing blood flow to the brain is a key function of paracetam and the other nootropics. Another function of the nootropics is that they're able to reverse scopolamine, which is an anticholinergic agent's ability to impair learning. When they do studies with rats and they give them scopolamine after they've learned something, they promptly forget what they learned. When they give them paracetam before they condition them and then give them scopolamine, they tend to basically have the same learned behavior preserved. So scopolamine, which is an anticholinergic anti-learning agent, is about 80 to 90% canceled out by the nootropic drugs in a broad range of animal experiments. Another property of nootropics is they protect the brain from things which want to poison it. A classic 1974 experiment by Georgia, they took rabbits and gave them several different barbiturates, secobarbital and allobarbital. In the controlled group, you may had 70 to 90% mortality. In the group receiving paracetam an hour before the barbiturate was given, you had 100% survival. They also had EEG machines hooked up to the rabbits, and the ones that were control groups, the EEG went flat within moments after the fast-acting barbiturate, whereas the cats that received the paracetam had normal EEGs long after the other cats were dead. Although they did briefly go unconscious, they very quickly recovered back to normal. Paracetam nootropics also are able to enhance the firing of locus coeruleus neurons. One of the things that goes bad in Alzheimer's disease is the locus coeruleus neurons. You all probably know that, of course, the hippocampal neurons in the middle of the brain, which have a lot to do with memory processing, these develop neurofibrillary tangles and almost look like Swiss cheese in a true Alzheimer's patient when you look at the brain upon autopsy. But the locus coeruleus neurons, which are noradrenaline-using neurons in the brainstem, in the reticular activating system, they also tend to go down both with aging, even non-pathological aging, as well as with various senile dementias. Various nootropics, including vinpocetine and including hydrogene, as well as the paracetam nootropics, have all been shown to significantly enhance the firing rates of locus coeruleus neurons, and these are what we call vigilance-enhancing neurons. The locus coeruleus neurons project up into the cortex. They are arousing, alerting, orienting neurons. They literally help us stay awake and focused and concentrated, and they tend to go bad, as it is the case in Parkinson, in men earlier ages than women. And anything that preserves and enhances the function of locus coeruleus neurons will literally preserve our attentional, concentrational abilities as we get older. And repeated experiments have shown the positive effect of nootropic drugs on the LC neurons. Another thing that's been repeatedly done with various nootropic drugs is they will hook up electroencephalograms to people, both normals and people suffering various dementias, and they find that as a person becomes more demented, whatever the exact cause, there's a pretty typical EEG picture. You get an increase in the delta and theta frequencies, delta being 0 to 4 cycles per second, theta being 4 to 8, the low frequencies. You get a decrease as a person becomes more demented, and the alpha, which is 8 to 12 cycles, and then the beta, which is 13 to 32 cycles per second. This is quite literally a vegetative brain EEG picture. Repeated, numerous studies with human beings have shown that even people in early to moderate phases of dementia, when they're given oxiracetam or paracetam or pramiracetam, their EEG picture normalizes back towards that of a more healthy, normal person. There is now less of the pathologic delta and theta space-out veg brain frequencies. There is more of the alert, awake, aware, alpha and alpha-adjacent beta frequencies. One experiment was done with the tranquilizer, one of the benzodiazepines. I forget which one it was, but anyway, same kind of thing. Ironically, the benzodiazepines create an EEG picture which is broadly similar to dementia. You increase the low-frequency delta and theta, and you reduce the higher frequency alpha and beta when you give somebody benzodiazepines. When they gave the test subjects oxiracetam, an hour before they gave them their benzodiazepine, and then an hour later they took the EEG, they found more normal EEG with much less of the theta and delta, but there was still adequate alpha, and alpha really is kind of like a mellow, idling brainwave space, you might say. So they still had some degree of tranquilization from the benzodiazepines, but they didn't have the loss of alertness that you normally suffer with benzodiazepines. So the best of both worlds. Nootropic plus benzodiazepine equals tranquilization, but with alertness. Now, one curious fact about the nootropics, at least the paracetam nootropics, it's been discovered is that excesses of either aldosterone or cortisol, or complete deficiencies of either aldosterone or cortisol, will nullify their effects. One needs to have adequate adrenal function, neither excessive nor too little, for the nootropics to work. The reason for this has not been yet verified. The speculation in the literature is that the aldosterone and even cortisol, which is a weak mineral corticoid, are needed to preserve adequate mineral ion effects. After all, electric current, when it passes down the nerve cell membrane, is generated by the rapid movement of potassium and sodium across the nerve cell membrane. And of course, sodium and potassium are regulated by aldosterone, and to a very weak extent by cortisol. So it's presumed that it has something to do with screwing up the mineral flux across the nerve cell membrane when there's either extremely excessive aldosterone and cortisol or completely deficient aldosterone and cortisol. The nootropics do not seem to press the button of a lot of the common neurotransmitter system. They don't seem to have any major effect on serotonin, which of course is what Prozac works through. They don't seem to have any major effect on dopamine. They don't seem to have any major effect on GABA. The main neurotransmitter synapses that the nootropics seem to work on is the NMDA, the N-methyldeaspartate glutamate receptors, and the cholinergic receptors of both the cortex and hippocampus. And of course, it's the cholinergic receptors of the hippocampus and the cortex that get scrambled most dramatically in Alzheimer's dementia. When they do studies with aging rats, as rats age, even without any form of formal dementia, the number of cholinergic receptors drops rather dramatically. When they give them paracetam or some of the other nootropics, they get an increase in cholinergic receptors in the septohippocampal and cerebral cortex areas on the order of 40% increase in receptors. And of course, again, if you look at an aging Alzheimer's brain cell, it's lost a lot of its dendrites. It's kind of like a feather with all the fronds picked off, with just the central axon. So anything that enhances and increases cholinergic receptors as we age, which will tend to drop with age, will tend to preserve a key mechanism of cognitive function, because the hippocampus is by now well proven to be central in memory and learning and conscious attention and focus. And of course, there's no coincidence with various forms of dementia, especially Alzheimer's, you lose your memory, you lose your mind, you can't focus, you can't think. So that's another key benefit of the paracetam nootropics. They seem to synergistically work through the glutamate receptors of the NMDA type, and those are the most common receptors throughout the brain, and the cholinergic receptors, which are key substrates for mental function, for thought, for memory, for learning, for attention and focus. There have been many studies done with the paracetam nootropics as well as pyritinol that show it's an excellent aid in what's called post-concussional syndrome. People suffer head traumas. They suffer severe concussion. They may go into comas. Pyritinol is a nootropic that has been so successfully used over many decades since it was introduced in 1961 that it has brought people out of a coma that is so severe that they died from it within a matter of a few days. But nonetheless, it was able to bring them up into more or less normal waking consciousness before they perished. At the very least, they could say goodbye to loved ones. I mean, it didn't save their lives, but it's a measure of how dramatic the brain resuscitation power of these nootropics is, that it can bring somebody out of a deep coma that's going to kill them within days from the head trauma they suffered. In less extreme forms of the post-concussional syndrome, Studies have shown that it relieves a lot of the most common symptoms that plague people that have suffered severe head trauma, such as vertigo and headache. And in fact, nootropics are often used to treat vertigo when it's a standalone symptom, whatever its cause, even when the cause isn't known. Some of the nootropics, such as idebenone, anhydrogene, and pyritinol, are what are called antioxidant nootropics. I mentioned earlier the brain is really more prone than almost any area of the body to free radical damage. Over a lifetime, if nothing else ever damaged your brain, free radical damage is almost like the ultimate rate-limiting variable about for how long your brain can live. Sooner or later, even if it takes a century or two, cumulative free radical damage will literally eat away your brain. As far as science knows now, that is inevitable. It's an automatic phenomenon that occurs from burning fuel through the electron transport side chain to generate ATP bioenergy. There's no way around it. However, we can help put out the fires so that this gradually accumulating damage occurs much more slowly rather than much more quickly. I mentioned earlier that the most damaging free radical is called the hydroxyl radical. And the brain is very prone to damage from hydroxyl radicals that are generated through the production of ATP bioenergy in the electron transport chain from glucose fuel. Well, for some free radicals, like superoxide, the body has endogenous enzymes that detoxify them. For superoxide, it's called SOD, superoxide dismutase. For hydrogen peroxide, the brain has two different enzymes, glutathione peroxidase and catalase, to help mop up those free radicals and get rid of them. Unfortunately, the human body does not possess an innate enzymatic defense against hydroxyl radicals. This is like the Achilles heel or the blind spot in our armor. We depend normally upon a handful of dietary antioxidants to protect us from hydroxyl radicals. The chief dietary protector against hydroxyl radicals is ascorbic acid, vitamin C. And by the way, if you look at the symptoms of terminal scurvy, which we have to go to your history books to find, but if you look at it, in terminal scurvy, the blood vessels break down, you have massive internal hemorrhaging, the teeth will literally fall out of the head, the muscles will wilt away, the hair will fall out. Terminal scurvy is identical, symptom-wise, to terminal radiation poisoning. And the common pathway to both is massive, out-of-control hydroxyl free radical damage going on throughout the entire body. When hydroxyl radical damage gets extreme enough, as it can, for example, if you were at Chernobyl at ground zero and stood there and when these millions of Roentgens are pouring out, extreme radiation damage that's hardly ever seen, but it is verified that it can and does happen, can melt the flesh from the bones within a matter of hours. That's how quickly hydroxyl radicals can dissolve and damage cellular microstructures. So vitamin C is our chief hydroxyl protector for the brain. That's one of the reasons why megadoses of vitamin C is so good for the brain. The two other main dietary hydroxyl protectors are proanthocyanidins. These are known in America as grapeseed extract and pine bark extract. The other one, ironically, is cholesterol. I certainly tend to agree with Dr. Wilkinson's position that high blood cholesterol often equals low thyroid, but I also believe that there's evidence that part of the cause of the high cholesterol epidemic of the modern world is that we are subject to so many things that trigger hydroxyl radical formation in the body, and cholesterol is a good hydroxyl radical quencher. And as a further corollary of this, the human brain in its dry weight is 7% cholesterol. If cholesterol is such a nasty thing, why are brains 7% cholesterol by dry weight? I'll tell you why. The cholesterol makes up a significant portion of every cell membrane and every organelle membrane in all of our cells, including our brain cells, and it's especially plentiful in brain cells. The cholesterol is literally part of those mitochondria, their walls, the bricks that make up the walls. So as these electron sparks that can generate the hydroxyl free radicals fly off the electron transport chain in the process of making ATP bioenergy, if they hit a cholesterol molecule, it quenches it. It puts out that electron spark, it stops right there, doesn't make a hydroxyl radical, doesn't spread next door to some other molecule like the DHA I mentioned and create a fatty acid free radical, a lipid peroxide. But still, these three hydroxyl quenching systems are, they'll keep us alive for 70 or 80 or 90 years, but it's a rare person in the real world that has a well-functioning brain after the age of 90 or 100. Even among those people who make it that age, not many of them have very good mental faculties by that time. They're often just alive because modern medical and nursing care and so on can, keep even a corpse going. but doesn't mean the brain's working anymore. So several of the nootropics, hydrogen, pyritinol, and idebenone, are powerful hydroxyl radical scavengers or quenchers. Idebenone is a really interesting nootropic. It is a close look-alike for the biomolecule coenzyme Q10, also called ubiquinone. Coenzyme Q10 is the linchpin of the electron transport chain. I'll talk more about this tomorrow in the energy lecture. And studies have shown that coenzyme Q10 is also a key antioxidant that is found in all the cell membranes, especially in brain cell membranes, and also in the mitochondrial membranes. Unfortunately, in low oxygen conditions, in hypoxia in other words, which might be due to ischemia, transient ischemic attacks, clogged arteries to the brain, whatever, you don't normally, when you have lower oxygen in the brain, have enough oxygen to keep the energy production going very well. That's why you pass unconscious after a few minutes without oxygen to the brain. But even a tiny level of oxygen is adequate to keep on producing free radicals, because oxygen is highly soluble in the lipid cell membranes, organelle membranes, which is full of fatty acids which get rancidified by low oxygen levels, ironically. At a higher level, oxygen is itself a free radical quencher. So this idebenone, which is a coenzyme Q variant developed in Japan, has been shown to work even better than the natural molecule coenzyme Q10, both at preserving electron transport chain energy production in the brain when oxygen is low, perhaps due to arteriosclerosis of the brain, perhaps due to a transient ischemic attack or whatever, and at the same time prevent the free radicals that would normally start occurring the moment brain blood oxygen levels drop below normal. In addition, as I mentioned, coenzyme Q10 is an antioxidant, but when it functions as an antioxidant, the moment it does so, it becomes what's called the ubiquinone-quinone free radical. It becomes a free radical itself, and a rather nasty one, that can start a whole another chain of free radical damage to localized molecules. Idebenone will fill in for CoQ10 both in the electron transport energy chain, which makes most of our ATP that all of our cells run on, and it can also fill in for coenzyme Q10 in cell and organelle membranes as an antioxidant, but it doesn't form a free radical form that is itself damaging in the way that coenzyme Q10 does. So idebenone is a nootropic that is quite literally a better CoQ10 and is an antioxidant that protects brain cells. For whatever reason, brain oxygen starts getting low. And of course, as we age, as I said, arteriosclerosis will plug up brain arteries, platelet clumping, roulette formations where red cells start clumping together. All these things can clog up the microcapillaries feeding discrete regions of the brain, produce local oxygen pressures, and that right away starts the free radical train rolling. So studies have shown with humans and animals that idebenone can protect the human brain for free radical damage when they temporarily lower oxygen levels to, say, the level that you would get at 20,000 feet of altitude. And again, idebenone has also been shown to actually increase the efficiency of coupling of phosphorylation to oxidation. What that means is when you burn fuels through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, you ultimately phosphorylate them as ATP, adenosine triphosphate, but some of what you burn will not be efficiently coupled into that phosphorylation or energy production process, making the ATP molecule. That's the 5% or so that leaks out as sparks, as it were, electron sparks, and creates free radicals that damage brain structures. Published studies have shown that idebenone can almost completely eliminate the leakage of electrons that normally occurs, otherwise inevitably, from the minute-by-minute production of ATP and all the trillions of mitochondria in your brain. So again, remember, normal energy production in your brain is the very thing that is destroying your brain over a lifetime. Ironically, it's the agent of entropy. And so idebenone and also pyritinol, which is also a powerful hydroxyl radical scavenger, can interrupt that. Now there are some nutrients that synergize with the nootropic drugs. Phosphatidylserine is a phosphatide that is actually part of the structure of your nerve cell membranes. With aging, it disappears, and taking supplements of phosphatidylserine for humans, even at 100 to 200 milligrams a day, has been shown to gradually replace the diminishing levels of phosphatidylserine. You can get a radical improvement in so-called age-associated mental impairment in humans, better memory, recognition of faces, sociability, involvement in daily life, and so on, just by taking phosphatidylserine alone. But when you take it in combination with the nootropics, it's very synergistic. For one thing, it also has been shown to enhance cholinergic neuron function, and it also enhances growth of new synapses of a cholinergic nature on the cholinergic neurons. So since the nootropics work so well through cholinergic neurons, phosphatidylserine is a natural synergist with them in enhancing and protecting cholinergic function, which is central to learning and memory and intelligence and focus and concentration. Another key nootropic-like nutrient, as Ward mentioned, is acetyl L-carnitine. Acetyl L-carnitine and hydrogen, which is a drug nootropic, will both improve the structure and function of the mitochondria in the brain. Remember I said earlier, the brain has to produce and use 20% of the body's total ATP energy supply. It's an energy glutton. But as Ward mentioned already, as we age, we end up with fewer mitochondria, but they're much larger in size. But these larger mitochondria, for various technical reasons, are less efficient in making ATP energy. So you can't just make up for fewer number by making them bigger. It doesn't work that way. Well, studies with both hydrogen and acetyl L-carnitine have shown that in aged animals, the size of their mitochondria can be reduced back after acetyl L-carnitine and hydrogen treatment almost to the size of a normal smaller mitochondria of a healthy young animal. So hydrogen and acetyl L-carnitine are a great combo to prevent this otherwise inevitable mitochondrial swelling that occurs in all the mitochondria throughout the body with aging, but I'm focusing on the brain, so that's what I'm concerned with here. And again, this inevitable mitochondrial swelling translates as less energy production out of the fuel that the brain gets. And when the brain has less ATP energy, what does it do? It falls behind on its continual remodeling and rebuilding project. Remember I said earlier, the brain cells never reproduce. How do they last a lifetime? Brain cells are continually regenerating their nerve cell membranes. It's one of the reasons we need to sleep. Overnight when we sleep, a lot of neuronal regeneration occurs. This is why that if you deprive somebody of sleep for a few days, they start to become psychotic. Sleep is not a luxury. It's what allows for kind of housekeeping, house maintenance, rebuilding functions in nerve cells overnight to make up for the wear and tear of the day. In fact, it's one of the reasons why an American now outlawed nutrient GHB, gamma hydroxybutyrate, was so beneficial. Studies in literature show that it actually accelerated the replenishment of neurotransmitter stores in the packets that store them at the end of neurons overnight. It actually increased the getting rid of the sodium that builds up inside a nerve cell during the day back out to the extracellular space where it belongs, and brings the potassium back into the nerve cell where it belongs overnight to get a little bit better rebalancing of the sodium-potassium picture of the nerve cells, intracellular, extracellular. Actual neuronal membrane repair of phosphatides and cholesterol and lipid structures occurs overnight. So the bottom line is that all takes ATP energy to occur. So when your cells in your brain are a little bit below normal in their ATP energy supply, they are not as efficient in repairing themselves night after night after night over a lifetime. And so that what that translates is over a lifetime, the repair efficiency goes down and down and down. More and more cumulative damage occurs in the nerve cell, and eventually it either dies or loses all its dendrites like in Alzheimer's disease, and it's as if it's not even there. It may still be alive, but it's not doing anything. It's just sitting there quiescent, not functioning as a nerve cell, processing information and passing on information to other cells. Nootropics have been used to treat all kinds of dementia with great success. I should say moderate to mild dementia. Once you get extreme dementia, you've suffered massive loss of structure in the brain. It doesn't come back. Probably nothing, at least up to this point, that's ever been discovered by science, has any hope of regenerating dead or gone or radically damaged brain cells. But the paracetam nootropics have shown good effect, as has pyretinol, as has hydrogen, as has idebenone, in moderate to mild dementia. But that, to my mind, is one of the less interesting uses of it. I mean, if you're a neuropathologist treating patients, that may be relevant to you guys. My interest in it, and a lot of us out in the west coast of America, which is almost like the nootropic cutting edge of the world, is in using the nootropics to expand our normal function into ever higher levels. I have talked to the musicians who use paracetam, and they tell me that their musical awareness, say of a symphony, of all the different orchestral instruments, in other words, the trees, we might say, as well as the forest, the overall flow of the symphony is heightened and enhanced. Nootropics allow you to see the forest and the trees simultaneously. Whole and part are integrated. Yin and yang are integrated. Intuition and logic are integrated. Instead of being at cross purposes to each other, logic versus intuition, reason versus emotion, male versus female, yin versus yang, whole versus part. Nootropics, through their both brain energization combined with their suprahemisphere connecting, promote an integrated brain function. They also increase attention and awareness. So what people who use nootropics, I don't want to use the word recreationally, that's not exactly the right word, but let's just say non-medically, what people who use nootropics non-medically find is it's as if their IQ goes up. They can read boring technical information for much longer periods of time than they could otherwise without falling asleep. They can integrate data from diverse areas of knowledge and see interconnections they never saw before. Their speed of learning goes up. Oftentimes just looking at a phone number or looking at some data bit will allow you to memorize it kind of automatically without even trying, without having to rehearse the memory as a lot of us do to aid in memory. So enhancing memory power, enhancing concentration, enhancing speed of learning, enhancing using both sides of your brain simultaneously so you get the benefit of reason and logic, or intuition and logic, is one of the benefits of nootropic drugs. They're not just for demented people or post-concussional people, or they've also been used to treat alcohol withdrawal, the mental deficiencies that occur after extreme alcohol use. Nootropics are not just for deficiency or medical problem situations. They are beneficial for housewives and scientists and everyday people who don't have any obvious pathology, and maybe if they're lucky never will. And because, as part of the definition is that they're pretty non-toxic, well, pretty means virtually non-toxic, many of the papers on nootropics, they very carefully check liver function, they check kidney function, they check all kinds of blood parameters, they do urinalysis, they take EEG pictures, some even do the electrocardiogram. They always come up with a totally clean bill of health, even with long-term high-dose use. They are probably the only class of drugs on the planet today that you can safely use indefinitely with no fear of problems therefrom. I've personally been using hydrogene off and on for 18 years. I've used paracetam continuously for 10 years, used quite a few other nootropics for the last 3 or 4 years. I've never been able to determine any side effects from them. Medical tests I undergo don't uncover any problems like liver problems or whatever. They're an amazing subcategory of drugs that allows for non-medical, going positively uphill use with no significant fear of toxicity or side effects. Now, nootropics have also been used in combination with a lot of other drugs. There's quite a few published reports of using nootropics like paracetam with anti-epileptics, especially Tegretol, carbamazepine. What they find is you can use a lower dose of the carbamazepine to get the anti-epileptic effect, and you also at the same time don't have the mental slurring, shall we say, out of focus that many people get on Tegretol. Nootropics have been combined even with like speech therapy for people suffering from aphasia, from strokes. And they find that they get about 160% better language skill reacquisition when they do placebo double-blind trials comparing paracetam plus speech therapy training versus the speech therapy training alone. So there's many different kinds of drugs that nootropics will synergize with, bringing out the good side, often lowering the dose, and in fact they also synergize with each other. In fact, one of the problems I have in my life is I have to kind of pick and choose which nootropics I'm going to use, because by the time you take ever more nootropics, you have to start reducing your dosage because they're all kind of complementary and supplementary and amplifying each other. And there's no question, although nootropics are non-toxic, at some point you're going to get overstimulated with them. The brain's going to be a little bit in too high of a gear, beyond 4th gear up to about 10th gear, and you won't be able to sleep. And, we can't think all the time, we can't read all the time, we can't cogitate all the time. That's the main drawback to nootropics. That's what it trends you toward. Fortunately, I get paid to do pretty much nothing but read scientific papers and write articles based on them. So for me, that's cool. But for most of you, you wouldn't want to be kind of stuck in mental overdrive all the time. Well, I could say more, but our time's about run out. So all I'll say is nootropic drugs, if you haven't tried them, that's one of the many benefits that International Anti-Aging Systems is bringing to America and most of the world, although unfortunately not to the European Union because of their regulations. But nootropic drugs They're the bee's knees. They're the best thing that I've ever seen come down the medical pike. They're a pharmacologic category literally unto themselves. And if you guys would have all taken your nootropics this morning before this lecture, you know, you could have remembered everything that every speaker said without even bothering to take your notes. So thank you for your time.